what do the following things have in common? Gangs, religious cults, the alt-right, Alcoholics Anonymous, therapy, flag football leagues, and moms' book clubs. These are all places where people go to meet a foundational human need. It's one that's always with us, and it never goes away. We're always attending to it, even without knowing it. It's the need to feel that we belong, that we're valued, and that our actions have meaning to something bigger than ourselves. Think back to a time early in your life when you felt this way. Now raise your hand. How many of you thought of an experience in school? Okay, a few, but not many. Because even though having this emotional and psychic need met is a foundational one, even though our ability to become healthy, well-adjusted adults is absolutely dependent on it, when it comes to education, we spend very little time thinking about the role that schools should play in nurturing this basic human need. We're in such a rush to make the work of schools more efficient, in producing the outcomes that we've traditionally cared about, performance in basic subjects and on tests, that we forget who we're doing it for, and what matters most to us about our kids' growth. As my own sons have gotten older, I've seen how we've drawn this artificial line between school and life, between education and their growth as people. But what if we could erase that line? What if we could acknowledge that feeling included, safe, and personally engaged is as foundational to education as it is in every other area of our life? To answer that question, let me introduce you to a young man named Michael. Michael is 17. He's an earnest young man, unusually committed to his academics. And if you met him, you wouldn't think that 3 years ago he'd been expelled from 2 schools and was sitting in the principal's office of a third after overturning a desk in class when he got frustrated. No one could figure out what the problem was. His past schools had been good schools. And yet Michael felt totally disengaged from his peers and from other adults, and it came across in this defiant, sarcastic, disinterested attitude. No one seemed able to break through, and it seemed as though Michael might go the way of so many young people who are disengaged with school, until his family heard about a school called Lighthouse. Lighthouse is one of a growing number of learner-centered schools that see the complex humanity of young people as the starting point for teaching and learning. And they see their responsibility as helping to develop that humanity, to develop the unique interests and the individual potential of young people. Adults facilitate learning opportunities and help young people take charge of their learning. Let's contrast that with traditional school-centered environments. These schools are about efficiency. They're about ranking and sorting young people, largely based on how well they measure up against standardized notions of what it means to be normal and smart. Learner-centered environments replace the 3 R's that most of us grew up with, reading, writing, and arithmetic, with 3 new R's: relationship, relevance, and reintegration. And the story of Michael's success at Lighthouse can tell us a lot about how these 3 R's work for young people. So let's start with relationship. When Michael started at Lighthouse as a sophomore, he was supposed to set up an internship for himself. But he didn't, because that's how he rolled, and he was sure he was going to be expelled again. But Lighthouse prides itself on not losing young people that other places have lost. His advisor, Mary, who had met him and had a sense that Michael might be reluctant to reach out, found him an internship at a restaurant called Paul's. The owner, Paul, was on his 6th Lighthouse intern, and over the years of collaborating with the school, he'd figured out how to integrate young people into his business in a meaningful way. So on Michael's first day in the kitchen, Paul walked him to the large counter in the center of the kitchen where he'd put a plastic bucket filled with about 100 pounds of onions, and he asked Michael to chop them. So Michael hacked and cursed his way through about 2 hours, and he got so frustrated that he stormed out early, skipped the second day, and barely made it through the week. But Paul didn't report him, he didn't berate him. He just looked him in the eye when he came back and told Michael that he expected a phone call if Michael had to miss another session. And he explained why that was important to the functioning of the kitchen. Over the years, and with Mary's guidance, Paul had begun to understand the school's philosophy, that giving young people a meaningful opportunity to connect with their community is the best way to foster a sense of belonging and purpose. And he'd seen for himself how belonging fosters curiosity and motivation. He'd seen how eagerly young people could learn once they started to trust him. And so in those first few weeks, Paul watched Michael. And when he had to step in, he talked with him about growing up in the neighborhood and his own struggles in school, how he'd come to start the restaurant. And he asked Michael about himself. And he watched the young man's resistance begin to soften. Michael, like other people in learner-centered schools, talks a lot about feeling seen, heard, known, and empowered. In a world where schools and educators and students are constantly pressured to perform and produce, where there's very little time to slow down, adults like Paul make space. Paul stood with Michael when he got frustrated and wanted to quit. "I'm here," said Paul. "I'll stay here. You belong here." Paul and the other chefs saw parts of Michael that he'd hidden away before. They supported him when he messed up and got frustrated. They showed him how normal it was to make mistakes, how they'd all done it. Through them, Michael became able to accept himself. And he began to experience himself as competent, likable, reliable. Through these relationships, Michael began to see himself in a new way, and that set the foundation for everything that came next. Which brings us to the second R, relevance. Now, Michael had asked his previous schools a pretty common question for kids: why should I care? And the answer we normally give them is tests, AP exams, getting into college, and that's clearly not enough. Because in our traditional system, the longer kids are in school, the less engaged they are. In 2016, 75% of third graders said that they felt engaged and valued in schools. But 12th graders, only 34% of them felt that way. If we tell young people that they go to school to take tests, and they don't care about the tests, where does that leave us? And where does it leave their sense of purpose? Feeling relevant helps young people to understand who they want to be in the world, and it helps them understand why what they're learning in school matters. And so schools like Lighthouse ask young people intentionally to think about the things that they find meaningful, and that often means getting involved in their communities. As Paul puts it, that sense of being totally focused on the task at hand and of contributing, if they can experience that here in my kitchen, they can take that sense with them wherever they go. So in Michael's second week at the restaurant, Paul asked him to saute onions for a base. Michael rushed it. He took 5 minutes to heat the oil and saute the onions before he called Paul over. And Paul peered into the pan. Without a word, he took down a second pan and started a second batch of onions. And he let those saute for 15 minutes while he put tomatoes and spices into Michael's batch. And when they were both done, he turned off the heat, handed Michael a spoon, and they tasted both. And Michael scowled. "Yeah, okay, mine sucks. But I mean, what'd you expect? I don't know what the F I'm doing." "I'm not blaming you," said Paul. "But you do need to understand why, and you need to taste the difference." And he proceeded to explain the chemistry of flavor, the role of oil and heat and time in transforming flavors. "You skip this step," said Paul, "you got no chance of getting the rest of the dish right." Michael was beginning to answer the question of why for himself, and no other school had ever invited him to do this. He saw that honoring the chemistry of cooking would make a difference in whether a client enjoyed their meal or not, and whether Paul kept or lost a customer. He saw that learning to chop well would make the difference between saving or wasting food and money. So as Michael began to know more about the restaurant, he became interested in the business side of it. So the next year, he did another stint at Paul's, focusing on the business aspects of the restaurant. He learned how Paul decided on menus and sourced ingredients. He figured out QuickBooks and Excel, and he began to make suggestions for how the business could be more efficient. Mary and his advisors at Lighthouse helped him turn what he was learning at the restaurant into the lessons that he needed for graduation and for his next steps in life. As Michael's contributions to the restaurant grew, so did his confidence. And as his confidence increased, he began to look up and out at the world beyond the restaurant. And that leads us to that third R, reintegration. The school-centered system of education that was developed about 150 years ago was designed around efficiency. And that meant pulling kids out of the world they lived in and setting their education apart from that world. It meant taking knowledge and breaking it up into discrete subjects that don't actually exist in the world where things are all integrated. And so, learner-centered schools put young people back into life and their communities to learn. And one of the things they learn is that everything is connected. Paul had told Michael that he had started the restaurant in the specific neighborhood that he had because he was interested in creating a neighborhood hub in a part of the city that was considered less desirable. He felt that an urban farm-to-table restaurant would attract a diverse clientele. Now, Michael already knew that his city was segregated by race and by class, but after talking with Paul, he began to notice that boutique restaurants and national chains like Whole Foods were in parts of the city that were whiter and more affluent, and that parts of the city that had more immigrants and minorities had smaller ethnic restaurants and fewer national businesses. So he became interested in how city planners made decisions. He learned about food deserts, about zoning, and residential segregation. In his senior year, he worked with Mary to put together a project where he was learning about residential segregation patterns and doing oral histories with residents to understand the impact of the patterns. And a common theme emerged. People felt disconnected, isolated, alienated from the city as a whole. For the first time, Michael began to wonder how he could make a difference. So, through Lighthouse, he proposed an internship at the city's Economic Development Office. And while he was there, he was learning about tax breaks and business incentives and understanding how this had an impact on a city's development. In his final paper, he proposed a cost-benefit metric that made the even distribution of economic opportunity across neighborhoods an explicit priority. And a local family foundation offered him a one-year fellowship after he graduated to build out this concept. If we want young people to be the curious, motivated, lifelong learners that we want them to be, we need to show them that success is not about ticking boxes. It's about making connections to the world, to each other, to their ancestry, and to their legacy. More than ever these days, we see young people who are desperate to make a difference in the world, who want to be involved in big changes in society. And if we don't harness their motivation the way that schools like Lighthouse do, we will lose them. Focusing on these 3 R's is also a recognition that broken young people won't really learn anyway. They might pass tests, they might go to college, but they'll be anxious, depressed, violent against themselves and others in big and small ways. Health researchers are finally willing to say that there's an epidemic of youth unwellness in the United States. Each year, 1 in 5 females and 1 in 7 males between the ages of 9 and 16 engage in self-injury. More than 30% of students who seek mental health services say they've seriously considered suicide. That's up from 24% a few years ago. Between 2006 and 2016, the suicide rate among kids younger than 13 rose by 114%, and the rate for all young people rose by 64%. Hospital admissions for suicidal teens have doubled over the last few years, and the highest rates occur soon after school begins every fall. And to be clear, these trends transcend race and class, because whether a young person is stressed because of homelessness or poverty, or because of ongoing pressures to bolster a college resume, the body and the brain responded in much the same way. Preteens and teens from affluent families experience the highest rates of depression, substance abuse, and anxiety disorders of any group of children in the US. Our current system of education produces young people whose heads are stuffed full of knowledge. They may be creative and entrepreneurial and do amazing things, but far too many of them lack the capacity to cope, to deal with the intensity of their emotions, to fail and get back up again, to be vulnerable and ask for help. And far too many of them are feeling unseen and wondering what it's all for. Now, people are going to wonder whether our schools have the time and the resources to address issues of belonging and purpose. I think our society can't afford to not make this change. Because if belonging and connectedness are foundational for human well-being, how are young people who are feeling anxious, depressed, and isolated ever expected to thrive? So many of the problems that we're trying to address in society, intolerance, racism, extremism, violence, substance abuse, mental health issues stem from people feeling alienated, objectified, and isolated. Think again about the places and the people you go to for a sense of belonging and purpose. How it feels to go through your days knowing that you're welcomed, that you know your way around, that you're carried through your life by people who nurture you and make you feel valuable. And now ask yourself how we can want anything less for our children. I can't. Schools like Lighthouse already exist all over this country. They serve kids as young as 3, and they go all the way through high school, but there just aren't enough. Because at the end of the day, every young person deserves the education that Michael was lucky enough to find. But for these schools to thrive, for this country to believe that this type of education is possible and necessary, we must accept that learning begins with purpose and belonging, and that any education that ignores that need will pile knowledge on top of frustration and loneliness. It'll never address the true cause of a young person's struggles or tap into the true wealth of her potential. Michael's going to graduate. He'll walk across the stage and get his diploma, which might land in a box or end up in a frame, but he will remember the faces of Paul and Mary in the crowd. He'll take with him a sense of the history and the texture of his community and a role for himself that he finds meaningful. And that sense is going to be the foundation for a life that he builds that's meaningful and full of purpose. Our kids, my sons, your daughters, need us, all of us, to see them as capable, relevant, powerful members of our communities. And we need them. We need them to go out into the world, secure in their sense of self, because that sense of belonging and purpose is the only foundation strong enough for them to build better lives for themselves and a better world for all of us. Thank you.